Hi, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us for this important conversation on women's political representation in Latin America. My name is Stephanie Lopez, and I am the program director at Latinas Represent, which is a national nonpartisan initiative focused on increasing Latina representation in the U.S. As a nonpartisan initiative, we do not support or endorse any candidate, party, or platform, so any views expressed by our guests are not necessarily reflective of our position at Latinas Represent. And so it is my honor to be here today with you all and with the speakers that we have, because we're partnering with our Reflectus Coalition partner, Represent Women, to help launch their latest brief on the state of women's representation in Latin America. The brief actually just came out today, which is very exciting. And Represent Women is a research-based advocacy group that promotes the use of system strategies to advance women's representation and leadership in the US and abroad. So today we're joined by Alicia Saxena, a lead author in Represent Women's Brief. We're also joined by academics Dr. Jennifer Piscopo and Dr. Magda Hinojosa. All of these women have incredible biographies, and I have shortened them to make sure that we have enough time for our discussion. And we also like to make sure that these conversations are engaging. So if you have any questions, please drop those into the chat. You can also start by dropping your name and where you're joining us from into the chat. We always like to see that as well. So when it comes to Alicia, she is a Master of Public Policy candidate at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy. Alicia started at Represent Women as a research intern, where she helped co-author 2 reports on intersectional barriers to representation for disabled women and first-generation women. I read both reports. They're very good. And she is also passionate about disability justice, electoral reform, marginalized community representation, gender parity, and intersectionality, and looks forward to furthering our understanding and research of these topics as a research associate at Represent Women. So Dr. Jennifer Piscopo is an associate professor of politics and the director of the Center for Research and Scholarship at Occidental College in LA, out of California. Her research on gender and women's political representation has appeared in over 20 peer-reviewed journals. She consults regularly for international organizations like UN Women and national governments in Latin America. Her work on gender quota laws has influenced electoral reforms in Chile, Costa Rica, and Uruguay. And she is also a frequent commentator in the domestic and international media. Her public-facing writing has appeared in outlets such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, the Boston Review, Ms. Magazine, and America's Quarterly, among others. See, very impressive. And last but not least, we have Dr. Magda Hinojosa. She is the director of the School of Politics and Global Studies at Arizona State University and a professor of political science. She received her PhD in political science from Harvard University, and her work examines women's political incorporation in Latin America. She is the author of Selecting Women, Electing Women, Political Representation and Candidate Selection in Latin America, published by Temple University Press, and co-author of Seeing Women, Strengthening Democracy, How Women in Politics Foster Connected Citizens, published by Oxford University Press. She has been invited to share her research with audiences in Canada, Chile, Colombia, England, Mexico, Peru, and at universities across the US. So we are in for a fascinating conversation with these incredible women. And just to kind of give you all an outline, we're going to start off by talking to Alicia first about the brief that, again, just launched today. And then we're going to start the conversation with Dr. Piscopo and Dr. Hinojosa. So, Alicia, my first question to you is, why was it important for Represent Women to study women's representation in Latin America?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So this is part of our Women's Representation and Global Strategy series that we are doing. We started with the post-Soviet states, then we looked at Arab states, and now we are looking at Latin America. Obviously, 3 of the top 5 countries for women's representation in the legislature are based in this region, and so it is very evident to us that they are doing something right. And so we really wanted to examine what are these strategies and how can we help the United States country which has progressed in many ways, but is also stagnated when it comes to gender equality. What can we do to push them in the right direction? And so we just wanted to analyze a region like Latin America, where current events continue to show that there is more and more success happening in the region every day. And so that's why we thought it was really important to study this region.
Well, I'm happy that y'all did, because at Latinas Represent, we obviously focus on Latinas in the US, but we also like to celebrate strong Latina leaders. And we know that a lot of times Latin America is often overlooked, right? And we want to make sure that we're bringing that information to the forefront. And like you said, I think that there are a lot of lessons to be learned that we could implement here at home as well. So in terms of, you mentioned that Latin America has successes. What is the state of women's political representation in Latin America, just generally? Obviously, there are various different countries and things look different in different countries, but generally, what does that look like?
Yeah, and so obviously, as you said, it's not uniform, but some of the things that we do find is that gender quotas are largely embraced as a strategy to catalyze women's progress towards gender parity. Argentina was the country that invented the concept of gender quotas. And I think the fact that this exists in many countries across Latin America shows strength in women. It shows how women's movements, individual women, worked within systems, worked through protesting, worked through grassroots organizing in order to get these systems and strategies implemented for women. And so we think that that's been a huge aspect of women's representation in Latin America. We also see that they've had some very innovative strategies for promoting women in their countries. And for instance, we see Chile. They're the first country in the world to have created a constitution with gender balance, with an equal number of men and an equal number of women. And so we see interesting strategies like that. We also see a little bit more of a top-down commitment to government and gender equality from governments themselves. Example would be in the executive cabinets. We see that more women are appointed in the Latin America region than what we see in other regions across the world, and that it's not just in areas of social welfare and education, but also in really important areas like the economy and health. And so we're really seeing that women are starting to be taken seriously in some of these governments. And so those are some of the things that we're seeing across the region. We would say in the judiciary is maybe where we see some of the most uneven progress across the region. We see some countries that do have a lot of women in their highest courts, but we see countries like Argentina, which though they have 43% women in their legislature, they have not a single woman in their Supreme Court. And we have countries like Guatemala, where women in the judiciary are being attacked and harassed despite, they're working high profile cases. And so their safety is being threatened. And so we do see some not uniform distribution there when it comes to gender equality. But I would say that's a general overview of the state of women's equality in Latin America.
Thank you. That was an incredible overview. And then for a lot of us, we focus very much on women's representation in the US. So can you tell us just generally, what do Latin American legislative bodies look like? Because some of them do differ substantially from what the US political structures look like. So just give us a little overview of that.
Yeah, so we had 19 countries that we included in this Latin America region, and we had 10 that are considered to be unicameral and 9 that are considered to be bicameral. So the United States would be considered to be a bicameral legislature, whereas in Latin America, we have 10 countries that are unicameral, meaning they only have one body in their legislature. There have been some people which believe that, the presence of more unicameral legislatures means that women's representation percentages are going to look higher, because we see that in upper houses in many bicameral legislatures, women are not as prominent as they may be in the lower house. But given that there's a pretty even split in Latin America, I don't think that this is influencing the high numbers that we do see. And I think it's genuinely just because of the progress that has been made. But that's just a quick overview of the legislatures.
Thank you. You answered one of my question, which was, is there any difference, right? So there isn't. There doesn't seem to be at this time. And so for those of us who want to walk away with a couple of like, oh, this is like a cool fact and figure that I learned that I want to share with folks, can you share a couple of the facts and figures that stood out to you during your research?
Yeah, I think I've thrown a few in there already, so I'll give you guys some new ones maybe. We looked at gender monitoring units and how many countries had those in their countries. We found that 10 countries of the 19 did have some sort of gender equality national action plan, whether in the past or in the present. And we found that 6 countries do have some sort of women's ministry or women's caucus that is explicitly dedicated to gender equality in government spaces. And so those were some interesting stats. We also see, countries like Nicaragua, they have 58% women in their cabinet, which is an outstanding number. And so those are just some of the stats on the top of my head that I could think of that would be some good takeaways.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And again, I do want to highlight that the latest brief from Represent Women came out today. It is on their website. We will plug it into the chat as well so that people have access to it. And now we're going to shift over. But Alicia, if you have any other thoughts as we're talking to Dr. Piscopo and Dr. Hinojosa, feel free to jump in as well. So now shifting over to Dr. Piscopo and Dr. Hinojosa, one of my questions is, Alicia covered some of the systems and strategies that have helped to increase women's political representation in Latin America. But in addition to those, what do you think are some historical and or cultural factors that we should think about as we talk about women's political representation in the region?
I'll go ahead and jump in and actually not speak to a historical cultural factor, but maybe to an institutional factor that Alicia didn't mention, but that I do think is important for thinking about women's representation in Latin America. And that's the fact that our Latin American countries overwhelmingly are depending on proportional representation systems to elect women. So by proportional representation systems, we mean systems whereby political parties are in charge with coming up with lists of candidates. And depending on what percentage of the vote those parties receive will determine how many seats they end up getting in the legislative body. That makes a really big difference for a number of reasons. One, and I'll let Professor Piscopo jump in with anything else that I'm leaving out, but one reason why I think the use of proportional representation systems is so important in understanding women's representation in Latin America is that it is very easy to combine proportional representation systems with gender quotas. So gender quotas typically will prescribe that a set percentage of candidates nominated by a political party be women, right? So this could be 30 or 40% of candidates nominated by a party are women. This is much easier to do in some ways when you've got a list system, which is not to say that gender quotas are a system that cannot be combined with the kind of system that we have for electing folks here in the United States. I think there is a facility to it that comes with the use of proportional representation that can be useful. In addition, some very early work on women's representation across the world noted that proportional representation might be easier or might be more likely to lead to greater levels of women's representation because political parties aren't just choosing one candidate, right? If you have a district system and a political party is nominating a person, they are nominating one person, right? And they might have many, many districts that they are nominating from, but they have to make a single decision for that one district. Whereas if they are putting together a list, then they can include different kinds of people, presumably to appeal to a broader range of interests, right? So it might behoove them in that case to say, to nominate some women, thinking that some people will be swayed by having some women on the list. It might behoove them also to include some ethnic diversity on their list or other types of diversity on their list. And so that proportional representations may end up leading to more diversity than you get in single member district systems.
That is very interesting. Thank you so much. Dr. Piscopo, do you have anything else to add?
I think I'll highlight 3 points that comes from the discussion so far. So I think I want to emphasize too the importance in Latin America about the way democratization and arguments about the quality of democracy have been leveraged to support the adoption of gender quotas and now gender parity. And so one of the things that's been really important is that feminist activists and women in the political parties who are often working together to pressure parties in the legislature to vote for gender quotas and then to to vote for gender parity are leveraging arguments about the importance of women's participation for the quality of democracy. Now, does that mean that every male legislator who votes for a gender quota law has fully internalized these arguments? Not necessarily, but it does mean that it makes it very difficult for you to stand up and publicly oppose them, right? So what you grumble about in private might be very different than the vote that you make in public. And those norms about the importance of women's participation for democratization and for democracy are really part of the quota origin story in Latin America. So while Argentina was the first country in the contemporary era to adopt a gender quota law, other forms of gender quotas actually existed in India and Pakistan back in the 1940s and 1950s. But when we think about this contemporary wave that Argentina launched in 1991, it really was because of these arguments about democratization. And actually gender quotas have been proposed in some other Latin American countries in the 1980s, and Argentina was the first to get that 30% quota over the threshold. The second thing is these norms about women's right to participate in politics, understood as el derecho de elegir y ser elegido, ser elegida. So not just the right to vote, but the right to be elected, have also been incorporated into a lot of Latin American constitutions, which gives a strong constitutional backing to the legality of gender quota laws and gender parity. And so Alicia mentioned Chile. So Chile has a constitutional convention seated right now, actually actively working on a new constitution. So there's gender parity in the constitutional convention. We don't know what the constitutional norms will be, but there actually are Latin American countries that don't just have the right to elect and be elected in their constitution, but actually have gender parity in their constitution. And I want to highlight the case of Mexico, which in 2019 passed a constitutional reform called Gender Parity in Everything, that is gender parity, not just in the legislative branch, but in the executive and judicial branches and at the federal, state, and municipal levels. And I see my colleagues and even co-authors from Mexico listening in and applauding. The last thing I want to say about Mexico, and then I'll stop, but Dr. Hinojosa was talking about the importance of implementing gender quotas and proportional representation systems. 1,000%. But it is possible to have gender quotas in single member district systems. And Mexico shows us that, because Mexico has what we call a mixed member system. So some portion of the lower house is elected using proportional representation. There's also 300 single member districts, and gender parity in Mexico applies to those 300 single member districts. How does it work? It means that when political parties are nominating their candidates, of the entire 300, if they're planning to run candidates in every district, half of those candidates have to be men and half of those candidates have to be women. And then there's a bunch of other mechanisms that, I won't geek out about, but the Electoral Institute uses to make sure that women are also being assigned to winning districts and not exclusively the losing ones. So proportional representation works for quotas, but if somebody tries to tell you that single member districts don't work with quotas, that is not true. And I am happy to give them a lecture about Mexico anytime to try to convince them that that is not true.
I love it. You feel free to geek out. I'm so happy that you're providing such helpful information. So we're going to switch gears a little bit. Dr. Hinojosa, you have done some incredible different types of research, and one that I found incredibly interesting was the different paths to power that women have access to in Latin America. So can you tell us what are some or one of the unique paths to power that women have access to in Latin America?
Well, thank you for that question, Stephanie. I know what of my work Stephanie is referring to. I wrote a piece once about women as beauty queens and how, having been beauty queens, this might have facilitated their move into politics. And I find this phenomena very interesting, but in no way unique to Latin America. We actually see that has been the case in the United States. It's been the case in countries across the globe. Of course, some places have more of a beauty queen culture than others do. And so in some places you get a lot of cachet from having been a beauty queen, not so much in others, but lest we forget Sarah Palin, she is back on the scene, a former beauty queen coming right back into politics, right? So it is certainly the case that we can have a number of different ways in which people can springboard into politics. And I think the phenomenon on beauty queens is certainly an interesting one, but it is very much parallel to what we see with men who have succeeded in sports, for instance, in using that as a springboard to political office. So I know that the beauty queens gets a lot of attention, and it's certainly kind of a neat little path to power, and we've seen it used very successfully in a number of cases. One of the best known cases, at least among a very small subset of humans like myself who are very interested in this phenomena, would be, so I was thinking no one else knows about this. What am I talking about? But a case that certainly drew my attention in many, many years ago was Irene Saez, who was a former Miss Universe from Venezuela, which of course has a huge beauty queen culture, who then used that position to not only end up as mayor of one of the most important municipalities in the city of Caracas, but also after very successfully being mayor, used that to run for the presidency. She was polling extremely well until Hugo Chavez came on the scene. And so we know how that story ends, right?
Thank you for sharing that one specific story. I think it's so interesting. And at Latinas Represent, we always talk about there are diverse paths to power. And sometimes we feel like people say, well, I need to be an attorney or I need to be a doctor and then I need to run for office. But obviously, some of the examples that you provided, a lot of people wouldn't even think about beauty queens, right? So there are a lot of different ways for you to enter into politics. And so, Dr. Piscopo, a question I have for you, I feel like you're like the gender quota person. Like I'm going to come to you with those questions. And so in your bio, we talked about how your work has influenced electoral reforms in different countries. Can you tell us about how your work has influenced those electoral reforms in like Chile, Costa Rica, Uruguay?
Well, if you're a real electoral systems nerd, it can get really fun to get in the weeds of how some of these, election laws work. And so one thing I want to say about the bigger picture, right, is going back to my comment about democratization, right? So broadly speaking, Latin American countries, went through a process of democratization in the 1980s and the 1990s. And so that's a very sort of stylized account. Different countries have different experiences. But a hallmark of this democratization was that electoral reforms have been rewritten a lot, right? Mm-hmm. They have been rewritten a lot. So that's a real difference from the United States, where we're working with the electoral system. The Constitution gave us, the 16th Amendment changed how senators were elected, but that was a long time ago, right? So Latin American countries are constantly innovating on their election reform. I think, Mexico has passed an election law about every 3 years since the 1980s that has done some sort of set of tweaks to the broader election system. So that means that women in the political parties, feminist activists, have a lot of opportunities to influence these laws. They have a lot of opportunities to tweak quotas, right? And so what we know about quotas is that often their initial versions have a lot of loopholes. The parties love loopholes. They get all of the public relation benefits of voting for a quota and passing a quota, but they don't actually have to run women. They don't actually have to run women in the winnable districts. And so every election reform is an opportunity, right, for women in the parties to try to, tighten that, tighten those screws, right? And so often, there can be opportunities to think about these finer points of quota design and how quotas can be designed or conceptualized differently. So Costa Rica is really interesting right now because Costa Rica has gender parity. They have a proportional representation system, they have gender parity, and they have both what we call vertical parity. So on that proportional representation list, women's names have to be alternated. They also have what we call horizontal parity, which is that across the number of lists that a party will run, so there's 7 districts in Costa Rica and parties will run 7 lists if they're running in every district. Horizontal parity means they need to alternate the first name on that list between men and women. So at least 3 of those 7 list headers must be women. Because what happens is that if a party doesn't win 2 seats, and of course they put the men first on all the list, then they elect all the men and they don't elect all the women. So what's happening in Costa Rica right now is they actually have a gender parity law. It's very strong, vertical and horizontal, but they want to change their electoral system. They want to do electoral system redesign. They are thinking of something that looks like the Mexican system, actually, that mixes PR and single member districts. And so actually the gender parity norm is so strong that they won't propose any reform unless they can figure out a way to keep electing 50% women. Right. So again, for where I started, where those of us who like to geek out, I'm just fortunate to have some opportunities with people that are thinking about how to change the Costa Rican electoral system and, how could they preserve gender parity? So we actually talked about, does Costa Rica want to do something like I mentioned with Mexico, right? Where they have these single member districts, but there's these regulations about how you distribute the candidates. So that's really important because the countries learn from each other, right? Now that doesn't always work. If it's a country like Chile, they don't really, they think they're special. And so they don't, telling them you could do it like Mexico does is maybe not persuasive in Chile, but it might be persuasive in Costa Rica. So a lot of what we do is sort of help countries learn from each other about what are the best practices from other countries.
I just saw Cynthia's comment in the chat, the United States needs to learn from Latin America next. And I would agree with that statement. And I'm so happy that you're doing that work to make those connections so that people are learning from one another. Governments are learning from one another.
And I should say the women leaders in every country are networked with each other as well, right? It's not just that US experts are coming in, right? But that these are partnership conversations and a community of, policymakers and scholars that study these issues. So I just don't want, I want that to be read as this is very much a conversation and a collaboration, not a, that we have all the answers and are sending it to these countries, right?
And can
Exactly.
I add something as well, Stephanie?
Of course.
I just wanted to add that in addition to the kind of cross-national collaboration and learning that is going on, there is, as Professor Piscopo already mentioned, a lot of learning that is going on within a country. So she mentioned that there is this tweaking of these laws. So, Mexico didn't originally start out where Mexico is today with half their Congress being women. That was not the case. And they weren't originally applying quotas outside of the proportional representation systems. That came after time, as Professor Piscopo, I think, mentioned. It is really a very iterative process of trying to improve on the thing. And you don't see the loopholes necessarily at the start. You have to try the system out and then realize how savvy politicians hell-bent on keeping certain folks out will exploit the rules. And only after you see it in action can you then plug up those holes.
Of course. And we have Georgina de la Fuente saying, happy to share more about the Mexican experience with our US colleagues. So love to see the networking and collaboration even happening on this webinar. And so to both of you, Latin America has an interesting history of shifting from left-leaning to right-leaning governments and kind of seeing these waves, in the early 2000s, the pink tide. Have we seen that women's representation has benefited from the dominance of either of these? So when the pink tide was in power, did we see more women's representation then, more women nominated in cabinets, or does it seem kind of the same on both sides?
So Magda and I wrote about this together, actually. The gender, there's a few different ways. So if we think about the legislature, right? I mean, the main story in Latin America is that the gender quota wave and the implementation of gender quotas is not a left-right story. So we see Latin American countries over the course of the 90s and the 2000s adopting gender quotas, no matter whether there's a left or a right president. And part of that has to do with some of the dynamics we've lifted up already, the arguments about democratization, the work of women in political parties, the sense that the initial laws were quite weak, so it doesn't really matter, right, if they're voted for, and then, later the advocacy to make them stronger. So we don't see a strong pattern for women in the legislature relative to left parties or right parties, because really quotas tell a decent amount of that story. Cabinet can be a different story, but again, we see a lot of variation in left or right presidents in terms of how they support and promote and appoint women to the cabinet. And some of the work that I did with Marika Blofield and Christina Ewig that was part of this larger project where Magda, Dr. Hinojosa, and I also looked at the question of quotas and left-right parties. We really focused on the differences and the kinds of left parties, even within the so-called pink tide that swept Latin America in the 1990s and the 20-aughts, the 2000s. There were differences. Some of these left parties were more social movement based, some of them were more institutionalist, and there was a lot of variation too. And then how the party and the presidents that were leading these parties felt that they had to reward their supporters. So unlike in the US, where it's really clear, public opinion data shows that Democrats are more supportive of women in office than Republicans. Democrats nominate more women. Democrats elect more women. We don't see that as a universal trend in Latin America.
I would absolutely agree that we don't tend to see this left-right split in terms of women's representation. I think some of my work from quite a bit ago now, looking at subnational women's representation, women at the mayoral and council member level, actually saw that some parties of the right were often doing better than parties of the left. And in some ways, that actually comes back to the question you asked me earlier about path to power. And it was very much about what kinds of individuals were rising up at a local level of politics and who was making a name for themselves. And because women have often been doing a lot of the labor of running a municipality and making things work, they were well known within their communities, right? They had real name recognition within their own communities, had respect of individuals. And one particular party of the right in Chile, I think, was taking advantage of their very good names and nominating these women for office. And they would approach women who hadn't previously even been part of their parties and say, we'd love for you to run for mayor under our label. It worked.
When I started my dissertation research a long time ago on this topic, I had the opportunity to interview a Mexican politician. And he said to me, the road to the top is long. For women, the road to the top of political power is long and it's full of men. And so that was a general statement, but I also think about that a lot when we think about political parties, right? And one thing we see, and this is not just in Latin America, I think this is happening globally, although not in the US, is a really important difference between old parties and new parties, whether they're on the left or the right. So in a multi-party system, so unlike the US, we have two parties, but in a multi-party system, you have a lot of parties. And in institutionalized parties that have been around for a long time, right? The path to the top is really cluttered with men, right? There's a lot of potential candidates. Parties feel like they need to reward their longtime supporters with candidacies, and those are often men. Often women get more opportunities in sort of newer parties. Newer parties might be desperate for candidates, especially if they need to field candidates in all the districts. And what's very interesting, for instance, right, in Western Europe right now, I know we're talking about Latin America, but in Western Europe right now, a lot of parties on the right are recruiting a lot of women. And it's not necessarily because women are more right, but it's because there are more new parties on the right than there are new parties on the left. And if you are a savvy woman and you're maybe somewhat conservative and you want an opportunity to run and win, you're going to have more chance in this new right party, even if it's farther to the right than you are, than you might have in the traditional right party. Because the traditional right party, there's more competition. And so I think we also need to think about, beyond that left-right split, there's so many other features of parties that really matter for women's pathways to success. And, if you're a smart candidate, you're going to go where you're going to get a chance, right? You might even compromise on some of your ideological principles if one party is going to give you a chance rather than another.
Thank you so much. I'm glad we're having this conversation about political parties in Latin America. And it kind of ties into the next question. And in the US, we talk a lot about campaign finance and we talk a lot about resources. So do we find that in Latin America, women have more access to resources and to campaign funds than men, or is it about equal, less? What are you all seeing?
Well, I think first we have to think about the relative costs of campaigns, right? So Magda and I also worked on a paper about looking at gender gaps in campaign finance in Chile. And I happen to know these numbers off the top of my head because I just looked at them yesterday for a podcast I was doing about gender and Chile's constitutional convention. So the average cost of a congressional campaign in Chile in 2017 are my US listeners ready? $225,000. You would be delighted to know that, I mean, that is a small fraction of what campaigns cost in the US. So I don't want to minimize that. That can still be a lot of money for an average Chilean, but we are not talking about the scale that we are thinking about at the United States, number one. Right. Number two, most Latin American countries have much stricter regulations on how candidates can raise money and how candidates can use money than the United States. I'm not saying that, shenanigans don't happen, but campaign finance is much more tightly regulated. Also, in many countries, media access is tightly regulated. Parties and candidates are given a certain amount of media time, airtime, television time, and that's it. So you could have all the money in the world. You can't buy any more media time. So very different landscape. That said, what we found in our study of Chile was that for non-incumbent candidates and first-time candidates, there still was a gender gap. So women still raised less money than men, right? And we do think this disadvantages them while campaigning. Because remember, the gender quota just puts women on the ballot. They still need to win. Mm-hmm. But for incumbents, we did not see a gender gap in campaign finance. So what that tells us, right, is that when women are well known, they can fundraise on par with men. And in some cases, the women incumbents were better financed than the men, because we think those are very sort of high quality women candidates. But we do see a disadvantage for first time or candidates. And so then it is harder for women who are running for the first time to get their name out there. And I'll stop talking.
And I'll just add just one more thing to what Jen just said. So I would just add that in addition to the costs being lower and the heavy regulation of campaign expenditures in Latin America, we also aren't campaigning for years on end the way it happens in the United States. So that also radically limits costs. And I think it actually makes things much more manageable for everyone, and whether you are heavily resourced or much less so.
Yeah, campaign time is fixed. It's usually about 8 weeks before the election. You cannot campaign before then, right? There might be internal campaigns within parties to be nominated, but it's not like the US where, people are running for president for, as soon as the presidential election is over, right?
Yeah. So I think that actually makes things much more manageable too for women to be entering politics in Latin America.
That is such great context to know. And I'm sure a lot of folks tuning in weren't aware of like the campaign finance and the resources and the timing of elections. So all of that is great background information to know as well. And so we are definitely focusing on gender parity at this moment, but I also feel, and at Latinas Represent, we feel very strongly that having intersectional representation of diverse groups is very important. And we know that in Latin America, there are indigenous groups and Afro-Latino groups and all of these like smaller subsections that sometimes don't get as much attention. So what role do you feel that gender parity has when it comes to increasing intersectional representation of diverse groups, such as indigenous folks, poor folks, disabled folks? Do we see that women kind of take that on? Can you give a little bit more information about that?
I think this is an issue that Latin America is certainly grappling with, and that there is certainly a real focus in the last few years on trying to increase the representation of a whole array of people and not just women. That being said, I think there's a long way to go for Latin America. It is only recently that we're even able to, I think, see any kind of data on the representation of groups. We hadn't been able to see whether people were represented prior, right? Even just getting data on women's representation used to be a much more difficult feat than it is today. So we're still learning about just how well certain groups are represented, and we have a better idea of some than others. Some are easier to pick out via either their names or some other identifier, right? Others, for example, you asked about people from different socioeconomic classes, would be much harder to be able to tease out. I do think that in some ways, the use of a proportional representation system can assist with the representation of a variety of groups. So for example, Professor Piscopo was talking about the Costa Rican case, where there is a political party of people who campaign and work for disabled rights, right? So I think the ability to have a whole array of political parties and not say just two political parties, which is usually what you end up with when the electoral rules of the game look like those of the United States, really can allow different people seats at the table.
I think Magda is absolutely right. I can add a little bit of what some countries are doing, right? There's so much room to go. But first, on sort of the single access approach, right? There are Latin American countries that do have mechanisms to facilitate the representation of Indigenous and Afro people in the legislature. So Colombia has reserved seats for Indigenous and Afro Colombians. Panama is another case where there's reserved seats for Indigenous peoples. But then if we start to think intersectionally, and so I'm looking at I'm looking at Lorena and Georgina, and I'm sure they can correct me if I'm wrong. But so recently in Mexico, in the latest Mexican elections, many Mexican states, so Mexico's a federal system, right? Mexican states have started adopting also quotas for Indigenous peoples, for LGBTQ individuals, for individuals with disabilities, for other marginalized groups. And what's really important is that they often intersect with gender parity. So if there's, say, a quota of a certain proportion of individuals that are Indigenous, then within that Indigenous quota, right, you still have to respect gender parity. So we do see now a lot of merging of these mechanisms in an intersectional way. Chile's constitutional convention had gender parity. It also had 17 reserved seats for Indigenous peoples for the 9 officially recognized pueblos or peoples of Chile. And they also had to respect gender parity within those 17 Indigenous seats. So we are starting to see from the institutional side a lot more attention to this and a lot more attention to the importance of thinking about gender quotas intersectionally. I also want to mention that for Chile's constitutional convention, there was also a 5% quota for candidates with disabilities. And so I asked some of my colleagues who work on the representation of people with disabilities, and to our knowledge, it was one of the first candidate quota cases for people with disabilities. Now that was for the Constitutional Convention, right? Not for the Chilean Congress. We'll have to see what the new constitution ends up saying about Chile's new election system. But I think there's a long way to go, but I do think there's hope, right? And there's hope for the creativeness of the way we can design mechanisms to elect more diverse legislatures.
Great, thank you. And we do have a question. Are women more likely to also represent another marginalized group, such as people with disabilities, LGBTQ folks, etc.?
I think the answer might depend in part on what we mean by represent. If you mean descriptively represent, i.e. also be a member of a different group. So women who are also have a disability, for instance, or women who are lesbians, right? That kind of representation would be one aspect of representation, but we might also think about whether women might be more likely to actively work for the rights and interests of, say, people with disabilities or members of the LGBTQ community, right? So those are two, I think, very different questions, actually. I haven't seen, like I said, there are basically no numbers on these other groups of people, right? We have some good data now on women, but whether we have good data on, say, the number of folks who are disabled or come from the lower socioeconomic classes, I just don't think we have enough data to know whether women are more likely to, say, belong to these other groups as well.
Great, thank you. And so one of the last questions that And Dr. Piscopo said, oh, and I forgot to mention the importance of the way gender parity in Bolivia has really benefited Indigenous women, since gender parity was itself part of the demands from the Indigenous social movement that came to power in Bolivia in 2008. And so one of the last questions that I have for both of you is, how can women of different nationalities support each other in this work? You have all talked about, having that cross collaborative effort with women in Latin American countries and academics, but like, for us who are not academics, do you think that solidarity is important in this? And what are some of the ways that we can practice solidarity on an international level, going both ways, right? Because the US also needs help when it comes to reaching gender parity.
That's a terrific question. I would say that one of the ways in which we can exemplify that solidarity might be to do a bit of naming and shaming. So, don't hesitate to call out your government for not doing enough to represent women, right? Like, don't be shy about saying, really? Did you know that half of Mexico's Congress is comprised of women? Do you really think we're doing that well here in the United States, right? So I think that kind of shaming is actually an important function of what we can do. So that requires some of the cross-national dialogues that are already happening, certainly. I do think that the women of Latin America are fantastic about dialoguing amongst each other, and feminist groups in Latin America have long been extraordinarily thoughtful and active in how they work together. I don't think that women in the United States have always been as proactive on that front. I think generally as Americans, we are losing, we don't tend to have very much knowledge of other countries, and certainly tend to have very good self-esteem. And so we think USA #1, without actually taking a step back and looking at how we are doing relative to so many countries of the world. I think that's an important element of all of this, is just calling attention to our own deficits and reaching out to learn from others in other countries who are doing much, much better in some respects.
I think if I may, Stephanie, can I also pick up on some of the questions that I see coming through in the chat before we?
Yes.
So Georgina had asked about, how would this work for the US? And so, if you talk to me a lot, I'm always going to come back to, well, this is just how our institutions are designed, right? And so I think I get asked a lot, would gender quotas work in the US? And so the main challenge in the US, right, is that, as I explained to my students, is that actually US parties have very little control over candidate selection. And so that's a really technical thing, right? So if I want to run, I live in Los Angeles. So if I want to run to represent Los Angeles in Congress, and I want to run as a member of the Republican Party, all I need to do, this is important, right? I'm not a Republican, but if I want to run as a member of the Republican Party, all I need to do is get enough signatures, and I go down to the County Board of Commissions, right, in LA, in Los Angeles, and I register myself. Okay. And the Republican Party can look at me and say, what is she doing? She doesn't share our values. She doesn't share our platforms. She's not really a Republican. We don't want her to run. They can't stop me. They literally cannot stop me. If I get enough signatures, I register myself, I'm on the ballot, and it's going to say Republican under my name, right? Now, the party could try to do some things to get voters to choose someone else. They could throw their weight behind other candidates, right? They could fund other candidates, but they cannot stop me from running as a Republican. In the vast majority of the countries that we work with, including in Latin America, who registers the candidates to run? The parties. The parties show up and they say, here, electoral authorities, here's our list of candidates. Parties control candidate selection in this very direct way, which is how you have gender quotas, right? You say to the parties, when you show up to the electoral authorities and you give them your list of candidates, we better see women and Indigenous people right on there. And if you don't, we're going to throw that list back at you and tell you to fix it. So it's not just that the US has a particular opposition to affirmative action. We could have a whole other webinar about that. It really is. And I've spent a long time thinking about quotas. I don't know how you do it in a system where the parties can't control who becomes a candidate, right? So that's one thing. And then on the other sort of institutional wonkiness, Cynthia was asking, many legislatures in Latin America have legislative committees that are dedicated to gender equality or women's issues. So just like in the US, we have an Armed Forces Committee or a Senate Judiciary Committee, right? Latin American countries are going to have, a committee on women's issues or a committee of gender equality. But again, it really depends on how these committees are designed, right? Are they actually given real policymaking powers in the legislature? So in Mexico, the committee is quite active. It's very strong. It serves as a place where women legislators from across the parties come together and think about where they do have shared agreement on issues they want to push forward. But it's all about how you design your institutions. And so then, Stephanie, to your point about why is this kind of solidarity so important? Because we learn best practices from each other. And I think women also learn that they're not alone, right? There's a rosy institutional picture in Latin America, but it by no means means that if you are a woman, your journey in politics is easy. There is still plenty of sexism from the political parties. There's plenty of political violence. There's plenty of sexual harassment. There are still so many obstacles in your path. And I think what we find is that whether the women are in Texas or California or South Carolina or Mexico City, when they come together, they have these common experiences, right? And that forms a bond and it helps them think collectively about how to improve the situation. So I just think these dialogues are so important for that.
And I would agree. And I'm so happy to have all of you here discussing these very important questions. And Magda, I did want to ask you Georgina's question. Out of the different models the amazing panelists have described, which one or which combination of rules do you think would fit the conversation in the US better?
That's a tough question. I mean, I kind of think, like Professor Piscopo said, that the rules are kind of the rules. We are both, I feel, very much institutionalists and think that institutions matter a lot. I would love to start from scratch. I really don't think our particular electoral system helps anybody out, whether that's women, whether it is folks from lower SES, any kind of marginalized groups, I don't think are benefited by a whole slew of our electoral rules, starting at the kind of electoral system we have, but then going towards our campaign finance practices, procedures. All of the rules of the game, I think, are so heavily stacked against a lot of different folks here in the US. I am of the view, and I have been studying women's representation in Latin America basically since the point when gender quotas became a thing. So they got passed, and then it just took a few years before gender quotas caught on across Latin America, and we saw a big dramatic increase in the adoption of gender quotas in the late 1990s, and that's when I was starting to do my dissertation work. And I have to say that I feel very strongly that if we really want to commit to change, we have to adopt gender quotas. I don't know what the current figures state, but it's usually something like without gender quotas, we can expect to be at parity in the US in just another like 200 years or so. I'm not willing to wait. I don't want to wait. And I do think that we have to completely restructure the rules of the game in order to make that happen. I do think that the use of a gender quota would get us a very good way towards real change in the US. But I also think our gender quota expert, who is definitely Professor Piscopo, can speak to that much better than I can.
I think you did great. That was perfect.
You would probably have outlined exactly what we need to do.
No, I think until the political parties have control over candidate selection, it's really difficult. And it's not just about having more women, right? I mean, my sort of stylized example about how I would become a Republican candidate in LA is this is how you get a Donald Trump. He originally, right, was not a member of the Republican Party. He was originally not seen as someone who shared the Republican Party's platforms or views, but opportunistically ran as a Republican because that's how he thought that he could win. And it's not that you don't have outsider candidates, right? Latin America can tell you a lot about, people that run as outsider candidates for presidents, but they have to go through the work of forming a political party and forming a party organization and getting it officially registered before they can run, right? They can't just kind of swoop in and transform the way an entire existing established party behaves. So I think there's a broader democratic argument, right, for why, parties should have some kind of control over candidate selection, although you still should also allow independents to run. So, what I like to try to tell my students is, as Magda said, we think from a US perspective, but the US is really distinctive in the way it does a lot of things in politics, right? Other countries are not doing it this way, and there's a reason.
I feel like we have all learned so much during this conversation. I want to thank you both so much for your time. And I have one last question, which was, to what level do political gatekeepers prevent diverse voices from getting on the ballot in Latin America? That just came in, and
yeah, so I'm going to let Magda talk a little bit more about party gatekeepers, but I think one of the most, we speak about political parties and new political parties forming, right? And so there's some downsides, right? You don't want your party system to fragment so much that the idea of a party label and what a party means becomes meaningless. And this is what we're seeing in some Latin American countries where there's such a multiplication of new parties. It's really disorienting for voters. But on the more positive side, a lot of these new parties, many of them, especially on the left, are coming out of social movements. And there's actually a real demand for diverse and intersectional candidates in many places, such of the kind that we haven't seen before. If we look at who ran for Chile's constitutional convention, it was a lot of social movement candidates coming out of indigenous movements, feminist movements. And this is really heartening, I think, and inspiring. And it has to do with this kind of desire for renovation in the political system. There's also horrible events that can be very motivating for marginalized individuals. So I'll give you an example. So a few years ago in Brazil, so Afro-Brazilians face a lot of marginalization, a lot of systematic racism, extremely similar to the systematic racism faced by Black Americans. And so a few years ago, there was a very tragic assassination of a Black gay woman counselor who was serving in Rio de Janeiro, and her name was Marielle Franco. And for a lot of Afro-Brazilians and women Afro-Brazilians, this really captured her death, right? Her assassination. She was a very outspoken advocate for marginalized peoples in Rio. Her death was a catalyzing moment, and it actually led to record numbers of Afro-Brazilian women running for office. And Kristen Wiley's done a lot of work on this. Now, we should not be motivating people with marginalized identities to run because they feel threatened. That is like an awful normative thing for democracy. But I do think we're seeing a lot of renovation in candidates, and especially on the left, just like in the United States, there is a lot of demand and consciousness in social movements and in social movements that are turning into parties that, things really do need to change. And so I don't want to paint too rosy of a picture. I'm not at all suggesting these structural exclusion patterns have been solved, but I do think there is some reason for optimism, and we're seeing new leadership emerge, and it's really inspiring. Magda, you can talk a little bit more about party gatekeepers, because I know that was the focus of your first book.
Well, I know that we are nearly out of time, so I would just say that parties are very much motivated by winning votes. And so if individuals can show that women or intersectional candidates of some sort are real vote getters, and as Jen just said, there's lots of reason for parties to be picking up on that message, then we absolutely will see party leaders open things up because they want to win.
Well, thank you so much for your final thoughts on that last question. I want to thank you all once again so much for being part of this really important conversation. And I will also want to direct you all to please check out Represent Women's latest brief on the state of women's political representation in Latin America. You can find that on their website. So thank you all for your time, and I hope that you have a great rest of your day and week. Thank you.
Thank you.